December 18, 1941. Near Volokholamsk, Moscow region. The morning air is sharp with frost and the acrid smell of cordite. Through the skeletal birch trees, a lone figure moves among his infantry comrades, checking positions, offering instructions. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrinenko has just climbed out of his T-34 tank, that steel beast that has become his second skin, his weapon, his shield against the Nazi tide that threatens to swallow Moscow whole. In 2.5 months of combat, this man has destroyed 52 German tanks and self-propelled guns, a kill rate so extraordinary that even his own commanders struggle to believe it. He is 27 years old. He is the most effective tank ace the Allied forces will produce in the entire Second World War. In less than an hour, he will be dead, killed not in the blaze of tank-to-tank combat, where he has proven invincible, but by a random piece of artillery shrapnel that finds him in the open. His name will be forgotten for nearly 5 decades. This is his story. To understand the magnitude of what Dmitry Lavrinenko achieved in those 75 days of combat, we must first understand the desperate circumstances that produced him. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by over 3,000 tanks and 2,000 aircraft, crashed across the Soviet border in a lightning assault designed to destroy the Red Army in a matter of weeks and capture Moscow before the Russian winter could intervene. The initial results were catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Thousands of tanks were lost. By September, German armored spearheads were racing toward the Soviet capital, and the Red Army was reeling from losses so severe that many Western observers believed the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. In this crucible of chaos and destruction, the Soviet Union began to field a weapon that would change the course of armored warfare. The T-34 medium tank, with its revolutionary sloped armor and powerful 76mm gun, represented a technological leap that stunned German tank commanders. When Heinz Guderian, the architect of blitzkrieg warfare, first encountered the T-34 in combat, he would write in his memoirs that his Panzer IVs could only destroy a T-34 by hitting its engine from behind with their short-barreled 75mm guns. The T-34's angled armor, no thicker than many German tanks but positioned at radical slopes, caused German shells to ricochet harmlessly away. Its wide tracks allowed it to move through mud and snow that trapped German panzers. Its diesel engine was less prone to catching fire than the gasoline engines of German tanks. On paper, the T-34 was a masterpiece, but paper specifications mean nothing without the men who know how to use them. Dmitry Fyodorovich Lavrinenko was born on September 10, 1914, in the Cossack village of Bestrashnaya in the Kuban region, a descendant of families that had served as warrior farmers on Russia's southern frontiers for generations. His childhood was marked by the upheavals of the Russian Revolution and Civil War, by collectivization and famine, by the brutal transformation of an agricultural society into an industrial power. Details of his early life remain scarce, lost in the chaos of those years. What we know is that in 1938, at the age of 24, he entered the Ulyanovsk Tank Academy, where he mastered the complexities of armored warfare. By May of that year, he had graduated, joining the growing ranks of Soviet tank officers as Stalin's regime frantically expanded its armored forces in preparation for the war that everyone knew was coming. Lavrinenko saw his first combat not against Germany, but in the brief campaigns that preceded the Great Conflagration. In 1939, when the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland under the secret provisions of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Lavrinenko was there. In 1940, when Soviet forces occupied Bessarabia in northern Bukovina, seizing Romanian territory, he participated in that bloodless conquest. These were not glorious campaigns. They were the brutal annexations of a totalitarian power expanding its borders. But they gave Lavrinenko something invaluable, something that would save his life again and again in the months to come: experience. He learned how to maneuver a tank under combat conditions. He learned how terrain affects movement and visibility. He learned how to read a battlefield, how to anticipate enemy movements, how to think 3 steps ahead. When Operation Barbarossa began, Lavrinenko was as prepared as any Soviet officer could be for the storm that was about to break over them. By early October 1941, the situation around Moscow had become desperate. The Wehrmacht had launched Operation Typhoon, the final push to capture the Soviet capital before winter. Three German armies supported by three panzer groups, over 1 million men with nearly 2,000 tanks, were converging on Moscow from multiple directions. Soviet defenses, still under construction, were being overrun. Four Soviet armies were encircled at Vyazma in one of the largest encirclements in military history. The roads to Moscow lay open. In the Kremlin, preparations were underway for the possible evacuation of the government. Panic spread through the capital. In those dark October days, every tank, every soldier, every advantage the Red Army could muster became critical to the defense of Moscow and perhaps the survival of the Soviet Union itself. Into this maelstrom came Colonel Mikhail Katakov and his 4th Tank Brigade, a newly formed unit equipped with a small number of the precious T-34 tanks that Soviet factories were beginning to produce in meaningful numbers. Katakov was an officer of rare talent, a man who would survive the war to become a marshal of the Soviet Union and one of the most respected tank commanders in military history. But in October 1941, he was simply a colonel commanding a brigade of Green Crews and untested tanks in the path of the most powerful military force ever assembled. Katukov understood immediately that conventional tactics would result in the annihilation of his brigade. The Germans had more tanks, more experience, better radios, superior training. In a straightforward engagement, Soviet armor was being destroyed at horrific rates. Katakov needed something different. He needed officers who could think unconventionally, who could turn the T-34's advantages into deadly tactical surprises. He needed men like Dmitry Lavrinenko. Lavrinenko commanded a platoon of T-34 tanks in Katukov's brigade, and from his very first engagement, it became clear that this was a tanker of extraordinary ability. On October 6, 1941, near the village of Pervy Voyn in the Oriel region, Lavrinenko's small group of 4 tanks encountered several dozen panzers from the 2nd Panzer Army, preparing to crush a Soviet infantry unit. The situation appeared hopeless. The Germans had overwhelming numerical superiority and the element of surprise. Any conventional response would result in the destruction of Lavrinenko's platoon. Instead, Lavrinenko did something that would become his trademark. He used terrain and timing to transform disadvantage into opportunity. Concealing his tanks in covered positions, he waited until the German formation rolled past his flanks, focusing their attention on the Soviet infantry ahead. Then at a range of less than 300 meters, Lavrinenko's platoon opened fire from multiple directions simultaneously. The effect was catastrophic. German tanks, caught in a crossfire, began to explode and burn. Their crews, trained to expect Soviet armor to engage from the front in predictable formations, found themselves under fire from unexpected angles. In the chaos, German tank commanders struggled to identify the source of the incoming rounds. Some turned to face one threat, only to expose their vulnerable side armor to another Soviet gun. Others attempted to retreat and collided with vehicles behind them. In the span of minutes, 15 German tanks were destroyed. The Soviet infantry, moments from annihilation, was saved. Lavrinenko's platoon withdrew before German reinforcements could arrive, melting back into the forest with minimal casualties. It was a textbook ambush, executed with a level of tactical sophistication that belied Lavrinenko's relative inexperience. But it was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, as German forces pushed closer to Moscow and the Battle of Moscow reached its climax, Lavrinenko fought in engagement after engagement, and a pattern began to emerge. Where other Soviet tank commanders charged forward to meet the enemy in the open, trading losses in brutal slugging matches, Lavrinenko struck from ambush. Where others relied on numerical superiority, he relied on surprise and positioning. He studied the ground before every battle, identifying hull-down positions where his T-34 could fire while exposing only its turret. He used forests, hills, and buildings to mask his approach. He exploited fog, snow, and the blinding glare of sunrise and sunset to close unseen with German formations. In one recorded engagement, he concealed his tanks by mounting logs on them to resemble artillery pieces, drawing German tanks into range before unleashing devastating fire at point-blank distance. General Dmitry Lavrinenko, who witnessed this particular ambush, would later recall how 9 German tanks were destroyed, along with 2 anti-tank guns, and numerous infantry, before the enemy even understood what was happening. The key to Lavrinenko's success lay not just in tactics, but in his mastery of the T-34 itself. Unlike many Soviet tank commanders who treated their vehicles as mobile artillery platforms, Lavrinenko understood the T-34 as a weapon system with unique characteristics that could be exploited. The sloped armor meant that positioning his tank at an angle to incoming fire increased its effective thickness even further. The wide tracks meant he could move through soft ground and snow that would bog down German panzers, allowing him to choose engagement ranges and withdraw routes that his enemy could not follow. The powerful 76mm gun meant he could penetrate German armor at ranges where their guns were less effective. Perhaps most critically, the T-34's relatively low silhouette made it easier to conceal in terrain. Lavrinenko used every one of these advantages. He positioned his tank where German commanders did not expect to find Soviet armor. He fired from ranges and angles that maximized his penetration while minimizing his exposure. He never lingered after an ambush, withdrawing before German artillery could range his position. But technology and tactics alone cannot explain what Lavrinenko accomplished. His fellow tankers described him as possessing an almost supernatural awareness of the battlefield. He seemed to know where the enemy would appear before they appeared. He understood instinctively how terrain would channel enemy movement. He could read the flow of a battle and position his tank exactly where it needed to be to deliver maximum damage. Some called it intuition, others called it genius. In reality, it was likely a combination of natural talent and obsessive preparation. Before every engagement, Lavrinenko personally reconnoitered the ground, studying it from multiple angles, identifying firing positions and withdrawal routes. He drilled his crew relentlessly on rapid target acquisition and firing procedures. He studied German tactics, learning to anticipate their movements. By the time contact was made with the enemy, Lavrinenko had already fought the battle in his mind a dozen times, considering every contingency, every possibility. When the shooting started, he was ready. The numbers tell a story that strains belief. In 28 engagements over 2.5 months, Lavrinenko destroyed 52 confirmed enemy tanks and self-propelled guns. In several battles, he destroyed 3 or 4 enemy vehicles in a single engagement. On at least one occasion, he destroyed 16 German tanks in a single combat. To put this in perspective, consider that most tank aces of World War II, German, Soviet, British, or American, accumulated their kills over years of combat, fighting from the beginning of the war to its end. Lavrinenko achieved his tally in 75 days. If we calculate his effectiveness rate, he was destroying enemy armor at a pace unmatched by any other Allied tank commander in the war. German aces like Michael Wittmann, Otto Karius, and Kurt Knispel would eventually surpass his total kill count. But they fought from 1941 to 1942, 1945, accumulating their scores over hundreds of engagements and thousands of kilometers of combat. Lavrinenko's rate of destruction in those desperate weeks of late 1941 suggests that had he survived, had he been given even one more year of combat, he might well have challenged the legendary German aces for the title of the most lethal tank commander of the war. German after-action reports from the Moscow region in October, November, and December 1941 make reference to sudden ambushes by Soviet T-34 units that appeared without warning, destroyed multiple vehicles, and vanished before effective counterattacks could be organized. Some reports describe a sense of unease among German tank crews, a reluctance to advance through certain terrain where the mysterious T-34s had struck before. German commanders, schooled in the doctrine of aggressive forward movement and confident in their technical and tactical superiority, found themselves confronting an opponent who refused to fight by the expected rules. The psychological impact of Lavrinenko's tactics extended beyond the simple mathematics of vehicles destroyed. Every tank he killed was one less gun threatening Moscow. Every ambush he executed forced German commanders to slow their advance, to commit more resources to reconnaissance, to hesitate before moving through terrain that might conceal Soviet armor. In a battle where time was as precious as tanks, these delays were invaluable. By early December 1941, The German advance on Moscow had stalled. The combination of fierce Soviet resistance, the arrival of fresh divisions from Siberia, the onset of brutal winter weather, and the overextension of German supply lines had brought Operation Typhoon to a halt. The Wehrmacht, which had expected to be celebrating victory in Red Square, instead found itself fighting for survival in temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Soviet commanders, including Katukov, began planning for a counteroffensive. For the first time since the invasion began, the Red Army would attack. Lavrinenko and his crew were among the units selected to lead the assault. They had survived 2.5 months of the most intense combat imaginable. They had become legends within the 4th Tank Brigade, which had been redesignated the 1st Guards Tank Brigade in recognition of its achievements. On December 5th, just days before the counteroffensive would begin, Lavrinenko was formally recommended for the title Hero of the Soviet Union for destroying 37 German tanks in permanent battle conditions. The paperwork was being processed. The award seemed certain. He had proven himself one of the most effective combat soldiers in the entire Red Army. The future, if such a thing could be said to exist in the winter of 1941, seemed bright. December 18, 1941. Near Volokholamsk, the Soviet counteroffensive is underway, and German forces are beginning to retreat under the pressure of fresh Soviet attacks. Lavrinenko's T-34 has just completed another successful engagement, destroying several more enemy vehicles. As the German forces pull back, Soviet infantry begins to advance to secure the ground. Lavrinenko, ever the careful commander, climbs out of his tank to coordinate with the infantry commanders, ensuring that the advance proceeds smoothly, that the soldiers understand where the enemy positions are, where the danger zones lie. He is exposed outside his tank, but the immediate threat seems to have passed. The German tanks are in retreat. It appears to be a moment of relative safety in an otherwise lethal environment. Then from somewhere in the distant German lines, a mortar crew fires. Perhaps they are covering the retreat. Perhaps they are simply laying down harassing fire on suspected Soviet positions. We will never know their intent. The shell arcs through the cold December sky, tumbling end over end, and detonates somewhere near the advancing Soviet infantry. Shrapnel, those irregular fragments of metal that kill more soldiers than any other weapon of war, sprays outward in a lethal cone. One piece finds Dmitry Lavrinenko. The impact is catastrophic. In an instant, the man who had survived dozens of tank battles, who had outmaneuvered and outfought German armor again and again, who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to escape destruction, is mortally wounded. His crew rushes to his side. Officers gather around, but there is nothing to be done. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Fyodorovich Lavrinenko, the most effective tank ace the Allied powers will produce in the Second World War, dies there in the snow, killed not by enemy tanks but by random chance, by a fragment of metal launched by an anonymous crew that will never know whom they have killed. The news spreads rapidly through the brigade. Marshal Mikhail Katukov, Lavrinenko's brigade commander, will later write that when he heard of the death, his eyes went black. The words capture something profound about the loss. Lavrinenko and death seemed incompatible concepts. How could a man who had survived so many battles, who had seemed almost untouchable in combat, die so suddenly and so randomly? How could someone who had fought with such brilliance and such courage be taken by a piece of shrapnel he never saw coming? But this is the nature of war. Survival is not a reward for skill or bravery. Death does not distinguish between the brilliant and the mediocre, between the hero and the coward. A random shell, a stray bullet, a mechanical failure, a moment of bad timing, these are the arbiters of life and death in combat. All the tactical genius in the world cannot protect a soldier from random chance. On December 22, 1941, 4 days after his death, Dmitry Lavrinenko was posthumously awarded the Order of Lenin, one of the Soviet Union's highest military decorations. The citation acknowledged his destruction of enemy armor and his contribution to the defense of Moscow. It was a significant honor, but it was not the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest award the nation could bestow. That recommendation was still working its way through the military bureaucracy when Lavrinenko died. After the war, Marshal Katukov, along with other senior generals who had witnessed Lavrinenko's achievements, petitioned repeatedly for him to receive the Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously. The petitions were denied. The official explanation, such as it was, centered on skepticism about the kill claims. Soviet military authorities found it difficult to believe that one tank commander could have destroyed 52 enemy vehicles in 2.5 months. Despite the testimony of witnesses, despite the battle reports, despite the documented engagements, bureaucrats in Moscow questioned whether the numbers were accurate. This skepticism might seem absurd given the detailed records that survived, but it reflected a broader pattern in Soviet military culture. The Red Army did not emphasize individual achievement in the same way Western militaries did. Kill tallies and ace statistics were viewed with suspicion, seen as potential tools for personal aggrandizement rather than accurate measures of combat effectiveness. Moreover, Lavrinenko's brief period of combat service counted against him in the Byzantine world of Soviet military awards. Heroes were expected to demonstrate sustained service, not meteoric bursts of effectiveness followed by death. Political reliability, longevity, and connections within the Communist Party hierarchy often mattered more than pure combat achievement when it came to the highest awards. Lavrinenko, dead at 27 after only 75 days of combat, did not fit the profile of the Soviet war heroes being celebrated in propaganda. He was too brief, too specific, too much of an anomaly, and so his achievements were noted, recorded, and then largely forgotten as the war ground on. And other names, other battles, other heroes filled the historical narrative. The decades passed. The Soviet Union emerged from the war victorious but devastated, having lost 27 million of its citizens in the defeat of Nazi Germany. The Great Patriotic War, as it was known in Soviet historiography, became the central myth of the Soviet state, the defining achievement of the communist system. Monuments were erected, memorials were built, heroes were celebrated, but Dmitry Lavrinenko was not among them. His name appeared occasionally in specialized military histories, in studies of armored warfare, in the memoirs of officers who had served with him. But for the Soviet public, for the world at large, he remained unknown. Part of the reason was simple bureaucratic chaos. Records were lost, units were disbanded and reformed. Officers who could have testified to his achievements died or were purged. Part of it was the nature of Soviet historiography, which preferred collective narratives to individual stories. And part of it was simply that in a war that killed tens of millions and destroyed entire nations, one tank commander, no matter how effective, could easily be forgotten in the deluge of tragedy and heroism that defined the Eastern Front. But history has a way of recovering lost stories. And in the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to open its archives and reevaluate its past under Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, researchers began to rediscover Dmitry Lavrinenko. Military historians, poring through wartime records and comparing Soviet and German sources, realized that the kill claims were not exaggerations. They were, if anything, conservative. Cross-referencing Soviet battle reports with German loss records confirmed that in those 75 days, Lavrinenko had indeed destroyed more than 50 tanks and self-propelled guns. Contemporary historians now believe that his actual total may have been even higher, as some of his kills were likely recorded as brigade-level achievements rather than credited to individual commanders. The evidence was overwhelming. This forgotten officer had been the most effective Allied tank ace of the war, and the Soviet Union had never properly honored him. On May 5, 1990, nearly 50 years after his death, Dmitry Fyodorovich Lavrinenko was finally awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The decree came at a time when the Soviet Union itself was on the brink of collapse, when the system that had sent him to war and then forgotten him was entering its final crisis. The award was posthumous, of course. Lavrinenko had been dead for nearly 5 decades. There was no family present at the ceremony to accept the honor. His parents were long dead. Whether he had a wife or children, the records do not clearly indicate. The award, when it finally came, was an acknowledgement of historical fact more than a celebration of a living legacy. But it was something. It was recognition, however belated, that this man had achieved something extraordinary, something that deserved to be remembered. Today, military historians recognize Lavrinenko as a figure of significant importance in the study of armored warfare. His tactics, particularly his use of terrain and his emphasis on ambush over frontal assault, anticipated developments in tank combat that would become standard doctrine in later conflicts. Modern tank commanders study his engagements as examples of how crew skill and tactical innovation can overcome numerical and sometimes even technical disadvantage. In Russia, his name has achieved a modest level of recognition among military history enthusiasts and in the communities near where he fought. Small memorials mark the places where his tank fought. His photograph appears in museums dedicated to the Battle of Moscow and the defense of the capital. Video games and military simulations sometimes include him as a character, a nod to his legendary status among armor specialists. But outside these specialized circles, Dmitry Lavrinenko remains largely unknown. His name does not appear alongside the famous aces and heroes of World War II in popular consciousness. School children do not learn about him. His face is not instantly recognizable. There are no major films about his life, no best-selling biographies that have brought his story to a mass audience. He remains what he has always been, a ghost in the historical record, a name in specialized texts, a footnote in the vast and terrible narrative of the Second World War. And yet his story raises questions that extend far beyond his individual achievements. How many other men like Lavrinenko existed? How many soldiers performed acts of extraordinary skill and courage that were never properly recorded, never celebrated, never remembered? How many heroes died anonymously in battles whose details were lost in the chaos of war? The Eastern Front was a conflict of unimaginable scale, where entire armies vanished in encirclements, where divisions were destroyed and reformed with new personnel and new names, where the sheer magnitude of the killing made individual achievement difficult to track and remember. For every name we know, for every decorated hero whose story survived, how many others are lost? Consider the nature of Lavrinenko's achievements. He destroyed 52 tanks in 75 days. Those 52 tanks represented 52 German crews, each of them men with names and families and lives now burned or blown apart inside their steel coffins. Those destroyed tanks meant that German formations were weakened, that attacks were delayed, that other Soviet soldiers survived who might otherwise have died. The ripples from Lavrinenko's actions spread outward through the battle, affecting outcomes we can never fully trace. Perhaps a German tank he destroyed in October would have broken through Soviet lines in November, allowing an encirclement that would have cut off Moscow from reinforcements. Perhaps infantrymen he saved went on to fight at Stalingrad or Kursk, contributing to victories there. The counterfactuals are endless and ultimately unknowable, but they remind us that history is made not just by generals and politicians, but by individual soldiers whose actions, multiplied across millions of combatants, determine the outcomes of battles and wars. In the final analysis, what should we make of Dmitry Lavrinenko's story? There is, of course, the straightforward military history, a highly effective tank commander who mastered his vehicle and used innovative tactics to achieve extraordinary results in a critical battle. That story alone is worth telling, worth preserving, worth studying for what it teaches us about combat and leadership and the nature of armored warfare. But there is also a more troubling dimension to the story, one that speaks to how we remember war and who gets remembered. Lavrinenko was forgotten not because his achievements were insignificant, but because the system that sent him to war did not value individual achievement in the way that would ensure his memory survived. He was forgotten because he died too soon, before his legend could become established, before enough people knew his name for it to survive in collective memory. He was forgotten because in the chaos and scale of the Eastern Front, even the most remarkable individual stories could be swallowed up and lost. The fact that he was eventually recognized, that historians finally recovered his story and secured him his posthumous honor, is a small victory for historical justice. But it came too late to matter to Lavrinenko himself, too late to give him the recognition he deserved when he was alive, and when such recognition might have meant something. This is the tragedy at the heart of his story. Not that he died, though that is tragic enough, but that he died unknown, unrecognized, and was then forgotten for half a century by the nation he had fought to defend. We cannot change that. We cannot restore to him what was taken, but we can remember. We can tell his story. We can ensure that his name survives, that his achievements are not lost, that the next generation knows that in those desperate winter months of 1941, when the fate of Moscow and perhaps the Soviet Union hung in the balance, there was a tank commander named Dmitry Lavrinenko who fought with skill and courage and deadly effectiveness, who saved lives and destroyed the enemy, and helped turn the tide of the greatest battle in history. December 18, 1941, near Volokholamsk, a piece of shrapnel flies through the cold air and strikes a man standing in the snow. In that instant, the most effective Allied tank ace of World War II ceases to exist. His T-34 sits silent nearby, battle-scarred but intact, waiting for a new crew. The war will continue without him for another 3.5 years. Moscow will hold. The Red Army will advance. Germany will be defeated. Millions more will die. And for nearly 50 years, almost no one will remember the name of the man who died that morning in the snow. But now we know. Now we remember. And in the remembering, we restore to Dmitry Fyodorovich Lavrinenko a small measure of the recognition he earned in those 75 days when he was, by any measure that matters, one of the greatest tank commanders ever to go to war. His story reminds us that history is not just made by those whose names survive, but by countless individuals whose contributions are forgotten, whose courage goes unrecognized, whose sacrifices are noted in official records, and then lost in archives and bureaucratic files. They fought nonetheless. They died nonetheless. And they mattered, whether or not anyone remembers their names. How many other Dmitry Lavrinenkos are out there, lost in the vastness of history, their stories untold, their achievements unrecorded? How many heroes died in obscurity, their names known only to their comrades who also died, their deeds lost when the men who witnessed them failed to survive? We will never know. We can never know. But we can remember the ones whose stories do survive. We can tell those stories, preserve those names, honor those memories. That is all history can do. That is all we can do. Remember. And in the act of remembering, rescue from oblivion the men and women who shaped the world we inherited, even if that world has forgotten them. Dmitry Lavrinenko deserves to be remembered. This story is his memorial, his monument, his place in the historical record that was denied him for so long. May it serve him well. May his name endure. May we never forget that on the frozen roads around Moscow in the winter of 1941, there was a tank commander who fought like no other, who struck fear into the enemy, who saved countless lives and who died too young and was forgotten too long. Remember him. Remember them all. That is what we owe the dead. That is what we owe history. That is what we owe ourselves.